She stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk and old lace, and not a single person in the crowded chapel looked at her with joy. The candles flickered. The air smelled of roses and cold stone. Somewhere behind her, a woman whispered behind a gloved hand, loud enough to carry. "Poor thing, he has not even glanced at her once." Eleanor Ashford kept her eyes forward, her hands steady around the stems of her bouquet, her back straight as a blade. She had been raised to endure, and so she endured. She endured the weight of 200 starring guests who had come not to celebrate, but to witness the strangest wedding of the season. She endured the hollow silence beside her, where the Duke of Valemore stood like a statue carved from ice and shadow, his face utterly unreadable. Alexander Montclair, the Duke of Valemore, the most powerful man in the northern counties, a man who had lost his first wife 4 years ago in a riding accident that half of society still whispered about in hushed, uncertain tones, a man who had sworn, publicly and coldly, that he would never marry again. And yet here he stood, marrying her. Not because he wanted to, not because he had chosen her, but because her father had once saved his life in a war that had ended a decade ago, and this marriage was the repayment of that debt. A contract signed in duty, not affection. The priest spoke words she barely heard. The ring slid onto her finger, cold and heavy. When the ceremony ended and the Duke finally turned to her, his eyes passed over her face as though she were a stranger in a crowd, barely worth noticing. "The carriage is ready," he said. His voice was low and smooth and entirely without warmth. "We leave for Valemore within the hour." He walked past her. He did not offer his arm. He did not wait for her to follow. Eleanor stood alone at the altar while the guests rose and filtered out, their whispers rising like smoke around her. She felt her heart fold inward, a small quiet collapse that made no sound. She had told herself she was prepared for this. She had told herself she could survive a marriage without love. But standing there in her wedding gown, watching her husband's back retreat down the stone aisle, she realized that nothing had prepared her for the weight of being invisible. The journey to Valemore took 3 days. 3 days in a carriage that smelled of leather and rain, with the Duke seated across from her, silent as a closed door. He read dispatches. He stared out the window at the passing moors. He slept in short, rigid stretches with his arms folded across his chest, never once softening in sleep. Eleanor tried. She asked gentle questions about the estate. She offered to pour his tea from the traveling flask. She commented on the beauty of the heather blooming along the roadside. Each attempt met the same fate, a clipped answer, a nod, a silence that stretched until she felt foolish for speaking at all. By the time the carriage rolled through the iron gates of Valemore, she had stopped trying. The estate rose before her, vast and gray and beautiful in a stern, ancient way. Turrets clawed at the low clouds. Ivy climbed the eastern walls in dark green cascades. A lake glinted silver in the distance. Servants lined the front steps, their faces carefully blank, their eyes darting to her with undisguised curiosity. The housekeeper, a tall woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes named Mrs. Pemberton, stepped forward and curtsied. "Your Grace, the household is prepared to welcome the new Duchess." Alexander did not pause. He strode past the servants, past the waiting footmen, and disappeared into the house without a backward glance. Eleanor stood on the gravel drive, still holding her traveling cloak close around her shoulders. The wind tugged at her hair. The servants waited. No one spoke. Mrs. Pemberton's expression flickered with something that might have been pity. "Shall I show you to your chambers, Your Grace?" Eleanor nodded. She could not quite trust her voice. Her chambers were in the east wing. Her husband's chambers were in the west. She learned this casually, the way one learns the layout of a grand house. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned it while gesturing down a long corridor hung with portraits of Montclair's long dead. "The Duke's rooms are in the west wing, Your Grace. You will be most comfortable here." Comfortable, such a gentle word for such a deliberate distance. Eleanor stood at the window of her new bedroom and watched the sun sink behind the distant hills. The room was beautiful. silk curtains the color of pale moss, a writing desk inlaid with mother of pearl, a fireplace large enough to warm the entire space. Everything a new bride could want, except for the one thing she had quietly, secretly hoped for. She had not expected love, she was not a fool, but she had hoped in some small foolish corner of her heart for kindness, for curiosity, for a chance to prove herself worthy of affection. Instead, she had been placed in a beautiful room on the far side of the house, as far from her husband as possible. She did not cry. She had trained herself not to cry. But she sat on the edge of the great canopied bed for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, and she felt the quiet ache of hope being slowly, carefully put away. The first month passed like a long gray dream. Eleanor learned the rhythms of Valemore. The servants were efficient and polite, though she caught them watching her with veiled expressions she could not quite read. The estate was vast and well managed, a testament to the Duke's rigid attention to detail. The days were filled with small duties she invented for herself. She arranged flowers. She wrote letters to her mother that she never sent. She walked the gardens in the thin autumn sunlight and tried not to feel like a ghost haunting someone else's home. Alexander was rarely present. He spent his days locked in his study or riding out to inspect the far-flung tenant farms. When he did appear at the formal dinners that Mrs. Pemberton insisted upon, he spoke to her in the same tone he might use to address a visiting dignitary. Polite, distant, utterly impenetrable. "I trust your rooms are satisfactory." "Yes, thank you." "The gardens are pleasant this time of year." "Yes, I have enjoyed walking there." "Good." Then silence, the clink of silver on porcelain, the soft footsteps of servants removing plates. Alexander would finish his meal, rise, and excuse himself with a stiff bow. She stopped waiting for more. The pain was not sharp. It was a dull, constant ache, like a bruise pressed gently each day. She had married a man who did not want her. She lived in a house where she did not belong. She was a duchess in name only, a title pinned to a woman no one truly saw. She began to spend more time in the village. It was a small act of survival. The village of Valemore nestled in the valley below the estate, a cluster of stone cottages and narrow lanes, and a gray church with a spire that caught the morning light. The people there were simple and warm, farmers and tradesmen and their wives, and they greeted the new duchess with cautious curiosity that soon melted into genuine welcome. Eleanor discovered that she was good at listening. She sat with the baker's wife, whose son had a fever, and she sent medicines from the estate's stores. She visited the schoolhouse and read to the children, their small faces turned up to her like flowers seeking sun. She helped the blacksmith's daughter practice her letters, kneeling in the dust with a stick to draw the alphabet. The villagers began to smile when they saw her coming. Children tugged at her skirts. Old women pressed her hands and called her a blessing. "The new duchess has a kind heart," people said. The words traveled back to the estate, as words always do. Alexander heard them. He heard them from his steward, from Mrs. Pemberton, from the vicar at Sunday service. He heard that his wife was loved by people who had no reason to love her except that she was gentle and present and kind. He heard, and he said nothing. But sometimes, when Eleanor returned from the village in the late afternoon, her cheeks flushed from the wind and her hands smelling of bread flour or ink, she would find Alexander standing by the window in the great hall, watching her carriage arrive. He never spoke. He never asked where she had been. But he was there, a silent figure framed by glass, and his eyes followed her as she crossed the graveled drive. She did not know what to make of it. She did not dare hope. The change began with a storm. It was late October and the weather had turned savage. Rain lashed the windows of Valemore for 3 days straight. The roads flooded. The village was cut off. Eleanor, trapped indoors, wandered the long corridors of the estate and tried not to feel like a prisoner in a gilded cage. On the third night, the storm knocked down a great oak on the eastern edge of the estate. The crash echoed through the house like thunder. Eleanor, unable to sleep, wrapped herself in a shawl and went downstairs to find the servants in a flurry of agitation. The tree had fallen across the road to the village. Worse, it had crushed the roof of a tenant cottage, and the family inside was trapped. Alexander was already in the entrance hall, pulling on his greatcoat. His face was hard with focus. He was issuing orders in a low, rapid voice. "Send riders to the village for help. Bring tools, ropes, lanterns." Eleanor stepped forward. "I am coming." He turned. For the first time since their wedding day, he looked directly at her, his eyes sharp and startled. "No, it is dangerous. I can help. I know that family. The mother has a newborn." She did not wait for his permission. She pulled on her cloak and followed the men out into the howling dark. The scene at the fallen tree was chaos. Rain slashed sideways. Wind tore at lantern flames. The great oak lay across the crushed cottage like a fallen giant, its roots clawing at the sky. Men shouted. Horses shied. Somewhere beneath the wreckage, a baby was crying. Eleanor did not hesitate. She climbed over broken branches, her skirts tangling and tearing. She found the mother huddled in a corner of the ruined cottage, clutching her infant, her face white with shock. Eleanor knelt in the mud and the splintered wood and wrapped her shawl around the woman's shoulders. "You are safe now," she said, her voice steady despite the wild pounding of her heart. "We will get you out. Hold on to me." She led the woman through the wreckage step by careful step, while the men worked to lift the heavy branches. The baby wailed. The rain poured. And through it all, Eleanor kept her arms steady and her voice calm. Alexander watched her from across the clearing. She did not see him watching. She was too focused on the frightened woman, the crying child, the dangerous tangle of broken wood. But he saw her. He saw her kneel in the mud. He saw her give her shawl to a shivering stranger. He saw her smile, soft and reassuring, while the storm raged around her. Something shifted behind his ribs, something he had not felt in a very long time. When the family was safe and the immediate danger had passed, Alexander walked to her. She was standing by the wagon where the mother and baby had been wrapped in blankets, her hair plastered to her face, her dress ruined, her hands scratched and bleeding. "You are hurt," he said. She looked down at her hands as if noticing them for the first time. "It is nothing." He took her hands in his. His grip was warm and surprisingly gentle. He examined the scratches, his dark brows drawn together. "You should not have come out here. They needed help." He looked up at her. In the flickering lantern light, his eyes were not cold at all. They were deep and dark and filled with something she could not name. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly. Then he released her hands and walked away to oversee the rest of the rescue, leaving her standing in the rain with her heart beating too fast. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed and replayed his words over and over. "You are not what I expected." It was not a declaration. It was barely a compliment. But it was the first real thing he had ever said to her, and she turned it over in her mind like a precious stone. Something had changed. She could feel it, thin and fragile as early ice. But thin ice breaks easily. The next morning, Eleanor came down to breakfast to find the great hall buzzing with an unfamiliar energy. Servants hurried with extra vigor. A carriage stood in the drive, its doors being polished to a high shine. Fresh flowers had been arranged in the entrance hall. Mrs. Pemberton intercepted her before she could reach the dining room. "Her ladyship has arrived, your grace." Eleanor's stomach tightened. Her ladyship. "Lady Rosalind Ashworth. She is a guest of the Duke. She has come from London to visit." The name landed like a stone in still water. Lady Rosalind Ashworth. Eleanor knew the name. Everyone knew the name. She was beautiful, wealthy, and widely rumored to have been the woman Alexander had loved before his first marriage. The woman he should have married, according to society's whispers. The woman who had never married at all, despite countless suitors, because her heart had always belonged to the Duke of Valemore. And now she was here. Eleanor walked into the dining room and saw her immediately. Lady Rosalind sat at the table beside Alexander, her golden hair arranged in perfect waves, her gown the color of ripe plums, her laugh light and musical as she leaned toward him. She was everything Eleanor was not: confident, polished, at ease in the world of wealth and title. Alexander was smiling, actually smiling. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines, warming his dark eyes. He looked at Rosalind with an ease and familiarity that Eleanor had never seen in him. She felt something crack inside her chest, a small fracture, the beginning of a break she had been trying very hard to prevent. "Ah, there you are," Rosalind said, turning her dazzling smile toward Eleanor. "The new Duchess. How lovely to meet you at last. I have heard so much about you." Her tone was perfectly polite, but her eyes were appraising, and Eleanor felt herself being weighed and measured and found wanting. "Lady Rosalind," Eleanor said, inclining her head, "welcome to Valemore." "Thank you, my dear. Alexander has been telling me how helpful you have been in the village, how very humble of you." The pause before humble was deliberate. Eleanor felt the sting of it, wrapped in silk. Alexander said nothing. He did not defend her. He did not look at her. His attention had already returned to Rosalind, to whatever amusing story she was telling about their shared acquaintances in London. Eleanor took her seat and ate her breakfast in silence, the food tasteless in her mouth. The days that followed were a slow torture. Lady Rosalind inserted herself into every corner of life at Valemore. She accompanied Alexander on his rides. She played the pianoforte in the music room in the evenings, her fingers dancing over the keys, while Alexander listened with a soft expression that cut Eleanor deeper than any cold silence ever had. She joined them for dinner, dominating the conversation with tales of London society and shared memories that excluded Eleanor entirely. "Do you remember the night of the Wellingtons' ball, Alexander, when you danced with me until dawn?" "I remember. You were a terrible dancer back then, all stiff legs and solemn faces." "I have improved." "Have you? Perhaps you should prove it. We should have a ball here. It has been far too long since Valemore hosted a proper celebration." Alexander did not agree immediately, but he did not refuse. And Eleanor saw the way Rosalind looked at her when she said it, a flicker of triumph, a quiet declaration of territory. The ball was announced 3 days later. Eleanor stood in the corner of the ballroom on the night of the event, watching her husband dance with another woman, and she felt the last of her hope crumble into dust. The ballroom was magnificent. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers. Garlands of winter roses draped the pillars. Musicians played a waltz from the gallery above. The great families of the county had come, dressed in silks and jewels, their laughter and conversation filling the vast space with noise and light. And Eleanor stood alone. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, chosen to bring out the color of her eyes. Her hair had been dressed with pearls. She had looked at herself in the mirror before coming down and thought, for a fleeting moment, that she looked beautiful. But no one looked at her. No one except the servants, who offered trays of champagne with apologetic eyes. No one except the village doctor's wife, who squeezed her hand and told her she looked lovely. No one except a few curious guests who stared at the Duke's strange, invisible wife before turning back to their conversations. Alexander had not spoken to her all evening. He had not asked her to dance. He had not even looked at her. He was dancing with Rosalind. They moved together with the ease of long familiarity, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, his hand at her waist. They were beautiful together. Everyone said so. Eleanor heard the whispers. They should have married years ago. Such a shame about his first wife. I hear the new Duchess is little more than a farmer's daughter. No wonder he keeps her hidden away. Eleanor stood very still. The music swelled. The dancers turned. And she realized with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that she could not do this anymore. She had spent months trying to earn a love that would never come. She had been patient and kind and hopeful, and she had been met with silence and distance, and now the public display of her husband's affection for another woman. She was done. She turned and walked out of the ballroom. No one noticed her leave. She walked through the dark corridors of Valemore, her heels echoing on the stone floors. She walked past the portraits of dead Montclairs, past the great oak doors, past the room where she had slept alone every night since her wedding day. She walked until she reached the small chapel at the edge of the estate, a quiet stone building where she had sometimes gone to think. The chapel was empty. Moonlight fell through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in colors of sapphire and ruby. Eleanor sat in the front pew and folded her hands in her lap and let the silence wash over her. She did not cry. She had trained herself not to cry. But she sat there for a very long time, and she felt something inside her shift and settle. A decision. A new direction. From this night forward, she would stop chasing a man who did not want her. She would stop hopping for love. She would build a life of her own, a life of purpose and dignity and quiet strength. She would be the Duchess of Valemore in truth. Not for him, for herself, for the people who needed her. She would survive, she would thrive, alone. The next morning she began. She rose early and dressed in a simple gray gown, practical and warm. She did not wait for Alexander to appear for breakfast. She ate alone in the small morning room and then went to the steward's office, where she spent 2 hours reviewing the household accounts. She asked sharp questions. She made notes. The steward, a nervous man named Mr. Finch, seemed startled by her sudden interest but answered her queries readily enough. "The tenant farms on the eastern edge of the estate have been neglected," she said, running her finger down a column of figures. "The roofs need repair. Why has this not been addressed?" "The Duke has been preoccupied with other matters, Your Grace. The Duke is no longer the only person responsible for this estate. I will visit the farms myself this afternoon. Please have the carriage ready." Mr. Finch blinked. "Yes, Your Grace." She visited the farms. She spoke to the tenants, listened to their concerns, promised them that repairs would begin within the week. She returned to Valemore dusty and tired and satisfied in a way she had not felt in months. Over the following days and weeks, she expanded her efforts. She reorganized the household staff, promoting a young kitchen maid whose talent had been overlooked. She established a weekly clinic in the village, bringing in a physician from the nearest town. She began a small school for the estate workers' children, teaching them to read and write and do sums. She was busy, she was useful. She was, for the first time in her marriage, truly alive. And she stopped looking at Alexander. She stopped waiting for him at dinner. She stopped lingering in the hall when she heard his footsteps. She stopped searching his face for any sign of warmth. She was polite when they met, gracious and composed, but the hopeful, yearning bride was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned to live without the love she had once craved. Alexander noticed. It took him longer than it should have. He was accustomed to her quiet presence, her soft attempts at conversation, her eyes that followed him with a longing she could not quite hide. At first, her absence was a relief. He told himself he was glad she had found other occupations. He told himself he did not mind eating alone. But then he began to notice things. He noticed that she did not come to the window to watch for his return from his rides. He noticed that her laughter, which he had rarely heard but had somehow always been there in the background, had disappeared entirely from the house. He noticed that she no longer wore the soft colors she had worn as a new bride. She wore grays and deep blues now, colors that made her look older and more distant. He noticed that she was beautiful. He had always known it in an abstract way, but now he saw it. The way she moved through the house with new confidence. The way she smiled at the servants, warm and genuine. The way she bent her head over account books, a small furrow of concentration between her brows. The way she looked at the village children with such tenderness that his chest ached. He noticed, too, that other people had begun to notice her. The young physician she had hired for the village clinic, a man named Dr. Henry Whitfield, was a frequent visitor to the estate. He was young and earnest and not unattractive, and he looked at Eleanor with an admiration that was not remotely professional. Alexander saw them together one afternoon, walking through the garden. Eleanor was explaining something about the new school, her hands gesturing animatedly. Henry Whitfield was listening with a smile that was far too warm. He laughed at something she said. She laughed too, a bright, unguarded sound that Alexander had never heard from her. Something hot and sharp twisted in Alexander's chest. He watched them from the window of his study, his hands gripping the sill. He watched Henry take Eleanor's hand to help her over a muddy patch of path. He watched her smile up at the young physician. He watched them walk together until they disappeared around the hedge, and he felt something he had not felt in years. Jealousy. It burned through him, fierce and undeniable. He tried to push it away. He had no right to feel jealous. He had been cold and distant and absent. He had driven her away with his own hands. But the feeling remained, gnawing at him, keeping him awake at night, following him through the empty rooms of his house. He began to watch her more closely. He noticed the way she poured tea, her movements graceful and precise. He noticed the way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking. He noticed the curve of her neck, the way a few loose strands of hair fell against her skin. He noticed everything, and everything he noticed made the ache in his chest grow sharper. He wanted to speak to her, he did not know how. He had built a wall between them, stone by cold stone, and now he stood on one side of it and she stood on the other, and he had forgotten how to reach across. The winter deepened. Snow blanketed the estate, turning the gardens into a silent white dream. The lake froze. The village huddled close around its fires. Eleanor's work continued. She organized a winter relief fund for the poorest families. She arranged for firewood to be delivered to the elderly. She visited the sick and the lonely, trudging through the snow in her heavy boots, her cheeks bright with cold. She was loved. The servants adored her. The tenants blessed her name. The villagers called her the people's Duchess, and the title was spoken with genuine affection. Alexander heard it all. He heard it from Mrs. Pemberton, who had grown fiercely protective of her young mistress. He heard it from his steward, who marveled at the Duchess's efficiency. He heard it from the vicar, who praised her charitable spirit. He heard it from everyone except the one person whose opinion mattered most. Eleanor herself had nothing to say to him. They were strangers now, sharing a house but living separate lives. She no longer sought his company. She no longer tried to bridge the silence. She was polite and distant and utterly self-contained, and it was driving him slowly mad. One evening, he found her in the library. It was late, past midnight. He had been unable to sleep, as he was so often unable to sleep these days, and he had wandered downstairs in search of a book to distract his restless mind. The library door was ajar, and candlelight spilled through the crack. He pushed the door open and found her curled in one of the great leather armchairs by the fire, a book open in her lap. She was asleep. Her head had fallen to one side, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulder. The firelight played across her face, softening her features, making her look younger and more vulnerable than she had seemed in months. Alexander stood in the doorway and looked at his wife. She was so beautiful. How had he not seen it before? How had he spent all these months in her presence and never truly looked at her? He crossed the room quietly. He took a blanket from the back of another chair and draped it over her sleeping form. His fingers brushed her shoulder, light as a breath. She stirred, her eyes opened, dark and drowsy and unfocused. Alexander, her voice was soft with sleep. "You fell asleep," he said. His own voice sounded strange to him, rough and uncertain. "I did not want you to be cold." She blinked, waking more fully. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, surprise, confusion, a shadow of the old longing quickly suppressed. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was polite again, controlled, distant. She straightened in the chair, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She did not look at him. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell her that he had been a fool, that he had wasted months. That he saw her now, truly saw her, and he did not want to lose what he had never even had. But the words would not come. They stuck in his throat, tangled with pride and fear and the weight of everything he had done wrong. "Good night," he said. "Good night." He left the library. He went back to his cold room in the West Wing, and he lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, feeling the silence of the house press down on him like a weight he could no longer bear. The following week brought the letter. Eleanor found it on the silver tray in the entrance hall, addressed to her in a hand she did not recognize. She opened it in the privacy of her sitting room, and the words she read turned her blood to ice. "Your Grace, I write to warn you. I served at Valemore many years ago during the time of the first Duchess. I know what happened the night she died. It was not an accident. Ask the Duke about the argument they had that evening. Ask him about the horse. Ask him why he has never spoken of it to anyone." The letter was unsigned. Eleanor read it 3 times. Her hands trembled. Her mind raced. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. The first Duchess, Lady Margaret, had died in a riding accident 4 years ago. She had been found at the bottom of a steep ravine, her neck broken. Her horse had been spooked, the official story said. A tragic accident. But there had always been whispers. Whispers that the Duke and his wife had been unhappy. Whispers that their marriage had been cold. Whispers that the accident had not been an accident at all. Eleanor had dismissed the whispers. She had refused to believe them. But now, holding this letter in her hands, she felt the ground beneath her feet begin to crack. She did not confront Alexander immediately. She did not know how. The accusation was too terrible, the doubt too dark. She carried the letter with her, tucked into the sleeve of her gown, and she watched her husband with new eyes. She noticed the shadows under his eyes. She noticed the way he flinched when anyone mentioned riding. She noticed the locked door in the West Wing, the room that no one was allowed to enter. She noticed everything, and everything she noticed fed the growing dread in her heart. Had she married a man capable of such a thing? She could not believe it. She would not believe it. But the doubt was there, a splinter lodged beneath her skin, and she could not pull it free. The tension between them grew unbearable. Alexander felt it. He saw the way she looked at him now, wary and watchful, the easy politeness of the past weeks replaced by something guarded and uncertain. He did not know what had changed, but he felt the loss of her tentative warmth like a wound. He tried clumsily to reach her. He began to join her for breakfast. He asked her questions about the village, about the school, about the accounts. She answered politely but briefly, her eyes never quite meeting his. She excused herself from the table as soon as she could. He brought her a gift, a book of poetry he had found in the library, a volume by a poet she had once mentioned admiring. He left it on her writing desk with a short note. She thanked him the next day, her voice careful and neutral. "It was kind of you." Kind, such a small, empty word. He wanted more. He wanted her. But every step he took toward her, she took a step back, and the distance between them felt wider than it ever had before. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon in late February. Alexander found her in the garden, standing by the frozen fountain. She was alone. Her cloak was pulled tight around her, her face pale in the cold light. She was holding a piece of paper. He approached her carefully, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. "Eleanor." She turned. Her eyes were red as if she had been crying. The sight of it struck him like a blow. "What is that?" he asked, nodding at the paper. She hesitated, then she held it out to him. "I received this a week ago. I did not know whether to believe it." He took the letter, he read it, and the blood drained from his face. For a long moment he did not speak. He stood frozen, the letter trembling in his hand. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were raw with an emotion she had never seen in him before. "Pain." "You believe this," he said. "It was not a question." "I do not know what to believe. You have never spoken of her. You have never told me anything. How can I trust a man who has given me nothing but silence? He closed his eyes, the letter crumpled in his fist. Come with me, he said. He led her through the house, through the west wing, to the locked door she had passed 100 times without ever seeing beyond. He produced a key from his pocket. His hands were shaking. The door swung open. It was a sitting room, small and elegant, frozen in time. A woman's writing desk stood by the window, still scattered with papers. A half-finished embroidery rested on a chair. A portrait hung above the fireplace, the image of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Eleanor recognized her immediately. Margaret, the first Duchess. This was her room, Alexander said. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. I have not opened it in 4 years. Eleanor stepped inside. She looked at the portrait, at the soft face of the woman who had come before her. She looked at the papers on the desk, letters written in a flowing hand. She looked at the embroidery, a half-finished flower, the needle still threaded. She was ill, Alexander said. For a long time, a sickness of the lungs. The physician said she would not live more than a few years. She did not want anyone to know. She did not want pity. He paused. His voice broke slightly. The night she died, we argued. She wanted to ride. The physicians had forbidden it. She was weak, too weak to be on a horse. I told her she could not go. She said she would rather die on a horse than in a bed. I shouted at her. I said things I should not have said. She went anyway. She took her horse and she rode out and she fell. He turned away. His shoulders were rigid. The ravine was treacherous. The ground was wet. Her horse lost its footing. It was an accident, but I have blamed myself every day since. If I had been gentler, if I had not shouted, if I had gone with her, perhaps she would still be alive. Silence filled the room. The weight of it pressed down like a physical thing. Eleanor stood very still. The letter, the rumors, the locked door. They were not the signs of a guilty man. They were the signs of a grieving one. I am sorry, she said softly. I should have asked you. I should not have doubted. He turned back to her. His eyes were wet. You had every right to doubt. I gave you nothing. I have been a cold and distant husband. I was so afraid of losing someone again that I pushed you away before I could even know you. He stepped closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. But I know you now, Eleanor. I see you. I see the way you care for the village. I see the way you carry yourself with such quiet strength. I see the woman I have been too blind to love, and I cannot bear the thought of losing you. She looked up at him. The frost around her heart began to crack. I stopped hoping, she said. I stopped hoping you would ever see me. I see you now. I see you, and I am sorry. I am so sorry it took me this long. He reached for her hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was steady. I loved you too late, he said. But I love you now. If you can forgive me, if you can give me a chance to prove that I am worthy of you, I will spend the rest of my life trying. The tears she had held back for so long finally fell. She did not try to hide them. She let them trace warm paths down her cold cheeks. You hurt me, she said. You made me feel invisible. I know. I will spend the rest of my life making up for it if you let me. She looked at him, at the man who had been so cold, so distant, so unreachable. She saw the cracks in his armor, the grief he had carried alone, the fear that had kept him locked away. She saw the man beneath the Duke, the man who had lost so much and was terrified of losing more. I want to believe you, she said. Then believe me, one day at a time, one moment at a time, let me prove it to you. She did not answer with words. She answered by stepping forward, by resting her forehead against his chest, by letting him wrap his arms around her and hold her close. They stood together in the room of his first wife, surrounded by the remnants of old grief, and they began, slowly and carefully, to build something new. The healing was not immediate. Trust, once broken, does not mend overnight. Eleanor did not suddenly forget the months of silence and distance. She did not suddenly believe every word he said, but she gave him the chance he asked for, and he took it. He showed up every day. At breakfast, at dinner, at the quiet moments in between. He asked her about her day and listened to her answers. He visited the village with her, meeting the people she had come to love. He sat beside her in the library at night, reading in companionable silence. He told her about Margaret. Slowly, in fragments, he shared the memories he had locked away. He told her about the early days of their marriage, the slow discovery of Margaret's illness, the years of watching her fade. He told her about the guilt, the grief, the fear that had consumed him. And Eleanor listened. She held his hand. She did not flinch from his pain. In return, she let him see her own wounds, the loneliness of her childhood, the weight of being a bartered bride, the quiet despair of feeling unloved in a house full of people. They learned each other, slowly, gently, with patience and care. The spring came to Valemore, and with it came a softness that had been missing for too long. The snow melted, the gardens bloomed, the lake thawed and glittered under the returning sun. One evening, as the sun set in shades of rose and gold, Alexander took Eleanor to the garden. They walked along the gravel paths, their arms linked, their steps unhurried. "I have something to ask you," he said. She looked up at him. His face was serious, but his eyes were warm. "What is it?" He stopped walking. He turned to face her. "I know our marriage began as a contract, a duty, an arrangement neither of us chose, but I am asking you now with all my heart if you will marry me again." She blinked. "Marry you again?" "Not in a church, not before a priest, but here, now, in this garden, just the two of us. I want to start again. I want to promise you the things I should have promised you before, that I will see you, that I will cherish you, that I will love you every day for the rest of my life." The setting sun cast golden light across his features. He looked at her with such hope, such vulnerable, unguarded hope, that her heart swelled until she thought it might burst. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you again." He smiled, truly smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face and made him look younger and lighter than she had ever seen him. He took her hands. He spoke his vows there in the garden under the wide evening sky. He promised to see her, to love her, to stand beside her always. She spoke her vows in return, her voice steady and sure. When they finished, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not their first kiss. They had exchanged a cold, formal kiss at their wedding, a brush of lips that meant nothing. This was different. This was warm and tender and full of all the words they had not said, all the time they had lost, all the hope they had found. When they drew apart, she was laughing softly, and he was looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I loved you too late," he murmured, "but I will love you for the rest of my life." "Then we have a great deal of time to make up for," she said. He laughed. The sound was bright and free, and it echoed across the garden like a promise. They walked back to the house together, hand in hand. The stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the deepening blue. The windows of Valemore glowed with candlelight, warm and welcoming. Home. It was a word Eleanor had never truly understood before. Valemore had been a house, a duty, a cage. But now, with her hand in his and the future stretching before them, she understood. Home was not a place. Home was the person who saw you, the person who stayed, the person who loved you even when you had stopped believing love was possible. She had found her home. She had found it in the last place she expected, in the heart of the man who had once been a stranger. And as they stepped through the doors of Valemore together, the silence between them was no longer cold and empty. It was full, full of understanding, full of hope, full of a love that had been lost and found and would never be lost again. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer alone. She was loved. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.